for me, in a very full 3 days to an hour that I have been really looking forward to. Raise your hand if you've been looking forward to Fireside Chat Innovator Studio with Tony Hsieh. Tony is going to be sitting down with Peake, who I've gotten to know a little bit in the last year. Chris joined Zappos in 2004 on the merchandising side of the business after a 12-year tenure in sporting goods in San Francisco. After more than 7 years at Zappos, growing Zappos into a household name, he stepped into various leadership roles on the visual design team, in technology, and in learning and development. More recently, he's found himself in organization design, helping Zappos and its employees transition to Holacracy, and since Holacracy to market-based dynamics. Chris is going to be sitting down with somebody who in this room needs no introduction. And so rather than reading his bio, which you've heard before, I want to share just a couple of personal anecdotes, things that I've observed about how Tony shows up in the world and how he runs his business. So something that we haven't talked about yet on stage this year is the Downtown Project, right? Zappos was founded in San Francisco, moved to Las Vegas, and Tony has invested a lot of his personal money in building up downtown. So in the 1970s, downtown was a hip and happening area. And then the Strip came along, and downtown became not a safe place to walk around. And then in the last 20 years, through Zappos' influence, through Tony's influence, and through the effort to building a community and building a culture within a city, downtown Las Vegas has seen a resurgence. And the way I know this is when I take a lift from the airport, I ask them, how long have you lived here? And I hear again and again, 20 years, 30 years. I say, tell me about downtown. They're like, oh, that's where I go with my friends. Like, sure, I work on the Strip or I drive tourists around. But when I go and hang out, I go to Ferguson's, I go to downtown. I hang out in old downtown Las Vegas. And I see this desire for experimentation in everything that Tony does. We feel it when we walk around campus, is how do we empower people? I don't even think that Tony has all the answers. I certainly don't, right? But this is about how do we take the folks, whether we're talking about Zapponians or individuals within each of our own organizations, and how do we take folks within each of our own organizations and help them find their voice, help them take their steps forward? Even when technology misbehaves, even when there's unexpected sounds and we keep moving forward, how do we give our people the opportunity to take their steps forward and express themselves, right? Because Zappos is not an expression of Tony Hsieh, right? It's an expression of the 1,500, 1,500 people who work within this organization and all of the customers around the world that this organization serves. Downtown, that's not about Tony Hsieh. That's about the community of Las Vegas and the natives and the locals and the folks who make their livelihood and their lives and their homes in downtown. So what I'm really excited to hear about is, what does it take to build an organization? What does it take to build a city? What does it take to build any community of people coming together and take that next step forward towards building something that is resilient and that can thrive? So without any further words from me, can I get a standing ovation for Peake and Tony Hsieh?
Why, thank you, everyone. It's so great to see a full council chambers. How's everyone doing? Good, good, good. First of all, I would like to give a lot of gratitude to all of you. Thank you for being in this community. Thanks for coming to Zappos, being at the Responsive Conference. A huge thanks to Rob and Willow and the team for putting on this great event. We always have a great time, a lot of great takeaways that we constantly build into how we're evolving the future of work and the way companies work. So give a round of applause to yourselves. Thank you for all being here and sharing this moment with us. Robin introduced Tony. I don't think you need any more introduction. I mean, really, at the end of the day, the entire world knows Tony for being this charismatic CEO of Zappos.com, a service and experience company. And he's the man behind the downtown revitalization. And it's pretty fascinating stuff to see on both sides. For me, Tony, for the last 15 and a half years, has been a great mentor. He's taught me about what it means to take risks, to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. He's constantly got our backs. And what I love about Tony most is his compassion and his care for people. It reflects in everything he does, whether it's here in the organization, or it's at Ferguson's, or it's just simply getting his time. One of the most compassionate people, one of the most humble people I've ever met in my entire life. So thank you for being that for me. But with all that said, who is the real Tony Hsieh? who are you, Tony? Like when you meet a stranger and they want to know about you.
I don't know. I think that's why I hate small talk. I don't know how to answer that question.
It's very true. It's very true. I missed this, but like one of the biggest connections I think Tony and I have is a little thing we do called the hand hug. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it, but basically you take your right hand, look to your neighbor, and the other neighbor puts up their right hand, and you just connect, and then you bring the thumbs around. So okay, do it to your neighbors. Do it to your neighbors. It's okay. It's okay. And feel free to wiggle it around if you want. It's a little weird, right? I know. Now everyone feels so much better, don't you? No, sir, you can't do it to yourself. It doesn't work that way. We appreciate you trying, though. All right, so on that compassion and care, one of the best analogies I've heard you talk about several times was this idea of the greenhouse. Would you mind kind of diving into what a greenhouse means to you?
Yeah, so I guess I don't consider myself at least what I imagine in my mind as a typical CEO, which, and I like to use the analogy of a greenhouse, where if you imagine a greenhouse and inside there's plants that represent the employees, and maybe at most companies or most large companies, the CEO is the tallest, strongest plant that all the other plants look up to and aspire to maybe be one day. And I think of my role as more as like the architect of the greenhouse, and really trying to experiment with figuring out different configurations and humidity levels and what's the right environment so that the plants can flourish and unlock whatever potential is already in them.
Yeah, where does that come from? Like, where does that belief come from?
I don't know.
Inside of you.
I think from even pre-Zappos and during the first, I'd say 10 or so years of Zappos, I personally oversaw and threw a lot of parties, and I never liked being the center of attention of the party, but I like the idea of how do you design the party environment so that people circulate and have a good time. And so I would think about things like, if you have a large party, for example, and there's 2 bars, what usually happens at most events is everyone stops at the first bar, and then there's a big crowd there, and then a lot of times people just get stuck there because they're talking to someone they ran into there, and then they never actually get to see the rest of the venue. And so what we would do sometimes is, during the first hour or so of the party, open up the back bar first and keep the front bar closed, and then people will always find the alcohol if it exists, and then open it up later, and then that promotes the circulation, and then people actually get to walk through it. So so I think maybe it came originally from this idea of like wanting to throw a good party, but not wanting to be the life of the party. And similar things for Zappos. Back in our when we were in Henderson, our first building that we leased in Henderson had it was kind of just this rectangular building, and the prior call center that used it had allowed employees to go in and out whatever doors they wanted on all 4 sides of the building, because the parking lot was behind the building. And so we made the decision to actually lock all the doors except for the front door, which is on the opposite side. And even though it's a longer walk to get there, what that created was like this collision point where everyone goes through the reception area, whether you're a visitor or an employee, and then there's just these impromptu, conversations that happen there. So that's actually one of the things that I miss about us not having in this campus, because our, most employees, I'm guessing, don't go to the lobby on a daily basis, whereas in our prior office, that was something everyone went through, and they also went out to lunch. So everyone passed through the lobby at least 4 times a day.
Yep. And as we think about our core values, John Bunch kind of talked about our core values and our culture yesterday. But with that belief, what are some things that this idea of collisions? What are some explicit things that we've done here at Zappos that you can look at and go, well, this is using the greenhouse analogy and using this whole idea of collisions, like what are some examples of like how you see that impacting the culture and the core values here at Zappos?
Well, I think the more collisions that happen amongst employees or in the downtown area, it's just the same concept on a bigger level. We think about how do we get more collisions from people walking around. And so in the Zappos context, there's the reception area example I talked about. We also have done a lot of thinking about how many square feet of office space per employee should we target. In the US, the average is, I think, around 300 square feet per employee of office space. But for us, we're at about 100 square feet per employee of office space. And the reason for that is because the research has shown that if you sit twice as far away from someone in an office environment, you don't see them half as often. You see them half as often squared, which is a quarter as often. And so it will make a pretty big impact on how often you're going to run into people. And then on the downtown level, it's kind of the same concept. I think for most adults, the last time it was normal to go outside and walk and just expect you're probably going to run into someone was probably back in college, where that's just normal in a college campus. And then I think most people graduate college and then they get out of that having everything that you need to live, work, play within walking distance. And so that's one of the goals for Downtown Project, is to kind of get to that, what we used to have in college. And so it's pretty normal. And I'm sure, like, when you go to bars or restaurants downtown, it would be almost weird to not run into someone,
And for us, I think those collisions are very similar to walking into a cafe, right? Or a co-working space where you're surrounded by all kinds of different companies, individuals, and talents. And oftentimes those collisions, and we saw a lot of it last night, there was even Zapponians that I put in touch for the first time. And what that does, it really kind of helps people understand who is working in the organization and what resources and support, competencies, experiences, skill sets, if you meet someone and say, hey, I can really use your help on this project that I'm working on, or this team, I would love to introduce you to this team because I think it could be a valuable asset.
Yeah, and there's also a difference between, even if it's the exact same two people, like if you and I run into each other here on the campus, like, we might talk about work stuff, but if you and I run into each other at a bar, we're probably going to have a few shots.
And a whole lot of ideas about how we can change Zappos, right? Speaking of which, I think we'll talk a little bit about the journey. And Rachel and Cameron, our two colleagues, gave a market-based dynamics workshop yesterday. I heard it day before. It went really well. A lot of interest in that from about 25 people or so. So we'll kind of get into market-based dynamics a little bit. But first, we want to talk a little bit about the journey of getting here, right? So I think when we look back at Zappos' history, and again, John Bunch reviewed a little bit this yesterday. But in 1999, it went from shoesite.com to Zappos, really, and that was really to not pigeonhole ourselves into just selling shoes. It wasn't, even though we had this big focus on service and experience, it wasn't until years later, it was 2006 that really we started, sorry, that's distracting, really getting around this idea of, like, we're a service company that just happens to sell shoes, or we're a service company that just happens to sell blank, right? I think it's the biggest photo op that we had in the lobby. A lot of people were taking pictures of that. But we think about, like, 2006, and now we're in 2019, and we think about, like, that is still an internal saying that we use, and a lot of you have heard that as well prior to this meeting. But what's changed for Zappos over the years since 2006? In your lens, how's the people changed? How's the business changed change. And how does that DNA of who we are and what we want to become, how has that changed?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've grown in terms of number of people, and even myself as CEO felt it just took longer to get things done, and there's more bureaucracy and more consensus building, the people that you need to make sure to sign off on different ideas and so on. And so I don't think it's any one person's fault. I think it's just a function of the number of people and the structure of a hierarchy. And so I think was just always thinking about, okay, what are other ways we can organize ourselves beyond hierarchy? Because one, hierarchies don't scale, and two, consensus doesn't scale. And John talked about the analogy of like when you're small, you're a motorboat, and when you're big, it's a cruise ship, and there's pros and cons to both. Mm-hmm. Cruise ship is safer, but harder to change direction and experiment with new ideas. And so didn't really have a specific thing in mind in terms of how to, I guess, not go down what happens with most companies. And on top of that, if you look at I think the Fortune 500 list came out in 1955, and fast forward today, like nearly 90% of those companies are no longer on the list or even existent, I think. And if you look at the average lifespan of S&P 500 companies, I think it went from 30 to 15, and it's getting shorter and shorter. And that's because the world is changing faster and faster, and companies are slow to adapt to change once they've kind of figured out, once they're of the size where they're large enough, they have a machine that is good at one thing, and it's great, and they work on making it more efficient. They're therefore more profitable. And the thing is, it's great until it's not, until there's competition or customers change and so on. There's actually, I think you and I watched a documentary about Tower Records, and like it's something like This Too Will Pass or something, which I would definitely recommend, because there's a lot of parallels in that, where they had to, when they were little, were very, it was like the early days with Zappos, and super fun, and people were kind of just partying and doing whatever, and then they got to like something like $1 billion in sales, and with CDs coming out, and seemed like they could do no wrong, and then 2 years later they were bankrupt and out of business. So the default future for companies is death. And so really starting about, okay, so how do you create an organization that's resilient, that stands the test of time? And what's interesting, like if you read up on systems theory and design, which is not a huge page turner for most people, but in any system, there's always a trade-off between efficiency and stability and resilience. And the problem with companies is efficiency is easy to measure, stability is at least easy to observe, but resilience is basically impossible to really observe or experience till you need it. And then when you need it, it might be too late if you haven't planned for it. And so start thinking about like what ultimately, to build an organization that stands the test of time, you need a resilient organization. And what are examples in the world of things that are actually resilient? So that was one thing trying to figure out. And then the other thing was most companies, as they get bigger, the average productivity or innovation per employee goes down just because it's more bureaucratic. And there are rules to follow and so on. And so I guess I view those as kind of two things we wanted to figure out ideally. And John mentioned in his talk that the answer is cities. Like cities are the longest lasting human formed organization that they stand the test of time and are around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so then I started researching, reading up on all the research on cities. And one of the most interesting is every time the size of a city doubles, innovation or productivity per resident increases by 15%, but you get the opposite effect in companies. And so the other cool thing I read about was, I think Manhattan has something like 3 days of food supply, but Manhattan never runs out of food, and there is no central food supply controller or manager. Instead, it's independent businesses and so on consuming food, which creates opportunities for independent businesses to deliver and supply food. And it's amazingly resilient. That there could be a natural disaster, a bridge can go out, and Manhattan never runs out of food. So it turns out the answer to both of those questions is in cities. And so then in reading more about that, really what that led down to is this whole reading up on and learning more about the official term is self-organization. And cities are an example of self-organization because the mayor doesn't tell its residents what to do or where to live. And there's plenty of examples in nature, like a rainforest. There's no CEO of a rainforest. And so how do you create the right constraints to have self-organization happen and have these emergent properties like, as I would love it if as Zappos doubles, innovation productivity per employee increases by 15%. And I also think if we do it purposely and experiment our way into it, we can actually achieve more than 15% because that whole city thing is just kind of the accidental historical average of what happens in cities. And so we've been on this journey for 7 years now. Of I think of it as we're just making steps towards becoming more and more self-organized, and so Holacracy is one tool that got us to a certain stage, and then we realized we want to layer some other tools and put them in our toolbox as well. I think there's a common misperception that we're not using Holacracy anymore, but that's not true. We just have another layer on top of it, and that's the customer-generated budgeting and market-based dynamics. So, we went from an org chart that's your standard hierarchy of people to a hierarchy of circles or teams, and employees can belong in multiple circles, but resource allocation was still top-down, kind of analogous to the traditional budgeting process in most places, to now each team or circle is basically its own mini startup, and we've built something called the CFO tool that has this concept of each team has its own bank account balance, and we basically over time came up with this thing called the triangle of accountability, which basically just came from us trying to think of what are the minimal number of constraints to enable the maximum autonomy / freedom and also maximum accountability. And so the three constraints or three sides of the triangle are whatever menu of services a circle offers, it needs to be in line with our culture and core values and our brand. And then the next one is whatever services are being offered, customer service or customer experience needs to be a differentiator. And then the last bottom line of the triangle is the bottom line, which is don't run out of money in your bank account.
Yeah.
And
Just break even on your profit and loss
Right.
for every team. So I think we'll take a step back. Like, let's talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But when we think about Holacracy, so we introduced Holacracy back in 2013. We did a pilot with roughly 70 people in our HR department at the time. And then, it took us about 2.5 years really to roll that out across the entire company and get people the education that they needed. But at that time, what was, you mentioned consensus, you mentioned, bottleneck decision-making and bureaucracy. But what was the reasons for you why we went with Holacracy, and why was it 2013? That was our very first, it was our explicit first step into saying we want to be a self-organized company. But for you, what was the reasons why, and why was it important in 2013 for us?
Yeah, I don't think there's ever a good time for change. So it's only 2013 because I didn't learn about it in 2012. So
fair enough.
But yeah, it was basically one of those things where it seemed like it checked enough boxes of some of the we didn't use the word at the time, but in Holacracy speak, some of the tensions that we had internally, and we would do things like encourage employees to, prior to Holacracy, encourage employees to go around to multiple departments, and I think there's some employees that have been in 8 or 10 different departments in their lifetime here, and that was something we actively promoted as a culture, but it was never a formal program. And one of my goals is for, at some point in the future, that every employee is able to find the intersection of what they're passionate about, what they're good at, and what creates value for the company. And so, yeah, they may be good at whatever job they were doing, but maybe their passion really is in, say, merchandising. And so we've had employees that started out at the front desk at Zappos, and then when there was an entry-level opening in merchandising, then they would go there and then maybe move on to another department if merchandising wasn't quite for them. And, there's this whole, hierarchy that's analogous to Maslow's hierarchy. There's Chris, I was going to say Chris Peake, but Chris.
I'm right here.
What's Chip Conley. Yeah, has a book called Peake.
Yes.
Right?
Without the E at the end.
Yes. Where he basically takes Maslow's hierarchy and simplifies it into 3 levels. And so for employees, it's all about what's the difference between a job versus career and calling. And so our goal is to, move employees up that. So I think that combination, which, I had not really heard of this whole idea of, like in reinventing organizations, they label it as a teal organization, and one of the things in there is about being whole, about wholeness, and I think that's something that we've always encouraged as part of the Zappos culture. But it's also, I think, it's not just about being able to, there's some places here in Vegas where you're allowed to put exactly 2 family photos on your desk, and you can't have your desk can't be messy or whatever, and so we've always encouraged people just decorate your desk however you want, and there's no limits except when the fire marshal comes by sometimes, and but
especially at Tony's desk.
Yeah. But so that's one way of being whole. But I also view it as like whatever your specific roles are, your actual job function, like that should be something that you're not doing just for a paycheck. It's because you love what you're doing and you believe in the ultimate, how it's contributing to the ultimate purpose of the company.
Right. And you mentioned triangle of accountability before, and I just want to kind of clearly define what that triangle of accountability is if you haven't seen all the posters out in the hallways in the lobby. But really, that one side is delivering on the very best customer service and experience. The other side is culture and core values. And then ultimately, it's breaking even on your profit and loss, right? And that's a responsibility, that's a constraint that every single team has in the organization. And we basically say to every team and every employee, you can do anything you want at Zappos, anything that you want, so long as you're simultaneously delivering on those 3 sides of the triangle. And so that's relatively new for us. We've marketed it pretty hard here internally, but really we came up with that at the end of last year. So I think it was September 2018, we started brainstorming that and did a soft launch, and then we ultimately got it out there to Zapponians around the holidays. But where did the triangle of accountability come from? If you look at the kind of the history of Zappos and how that integrated into one very simple visual that Zapponians and even external people can understand, where did that come from?
Well, I think that's just a natural, like if you just look at the history of Zappos, we decided early on that we wanted I think it was 2003, we wanted our brand to be about the very best customer service and customer experience. And, at the time, I think some people thought we were a little crazy, and how can an online company actually do that and build that reputation? And so we did that, and so now that after 2003, that was kind of a filter for making sure that we lived up to that brand promise. And so some examples of how that manifested itself was, at the time we had 75% of our inventory was being shipped out of our warehouse, and 25% were being drop shipped from manufacturers, meaning we didn't actually have to carry the inventory. And And so on paper, if you don't have the overhead of carrying inventory, then it looks much better as a business in terms of the bottom line. And the problem, at least at the time, was that our vendors that were drop shipping for us weren't set up to really drop ship individual orders. And also their inventory counts weren't super accurate. And so for a lot of them, like maybe 20 or 30% of the orders that were placed from the vendor's inventory didn't even exist, or it would ship late by 5 or 10 days because they had to go find it in their warehouse. And as much money as we were making from it, we realized that that wasn't being true to our brand. And now that we wanted it to be about customer service. And so literally overnight, we flipped a switch and decided to walk away from that 25% of business, which was both the hardest and easiest decision to make at the time. It was easiest because we knew that was the right thing for the company. Hard because we weren't profitable, and this made us even less profitable. Another example is we started out in San Francisco in 1999, and we moved the entire company here to the Vegas area in 2004. And the reason we did that, we had about 90 employees at the time, and about 70 ended up moving with the company to Vegas. And the reason we did that was because in the Bay Area, no one really wanted to do customer service as a career. As our customer service reps at the time were all people in temp agencies that were just working a temp job till they went into tech or got discovered as an artist or something. Whereas Vegas is a 24/7 service-focused city. We thought it would make our existing employees the happiest. And I know my original plan when we first moved was I would go back to the Bay Area every other weekend for a long weekend. And I did that once. And then I know Vegas has a funny way of growing on you, because living here as a resident is very different from coming as a tourist. So that was, so we started out with customer service being a constraint, is how I think about it, and which dictated a lot of businesses we couldn't get into. So shoes are high enough margin where we can afford to do free shipping both ways, or have surprise upgrades to overnight shipping, and have customers call our call center and stay on the phone for, I think the record is now 10 hours for a single phone call. Whereas if we were...
Two pee breaks.
Yeah, whereas if we were selling electronics, which are low margins, we wouldn't have enough margin to do all those things. And so the choice is either don't sell electronics or give subpar service if we're going to sell electronics. And so with that constraint, we decided we're just going to walk away from electronics, even though it's a huge market from a revenue standpoint. So that was one constraint. And then in 2000, I forget, it's 5 or 6. I think 5 we started the process, and 6 was when we rolled out our core values and decided that company culture had always been important to us, because in my prior startup, this was 96 to 98. We grew that to about 100 or so people, and then ended up selling the company to Microsoft. But what a lot of people don't know is the real reason we ended up selling it is just because it just was not a fun place to work at anymore. And I remember when it's just, 5 or 10 of us, it was a lot of fun. We were all friends, and we were working around the kind of your typical .com, working around the clock, sleeping under our desks, had no idea what day of the week it was, but in a good way, just because we were so into what we were doing. And then as we started hiring, we would hire friends and friends of friends, which actually worked really well for our culture and made it continue to be a lot of fun until we ran into about 20 people or so. And then we ran into a major problem. And the problem was we basically ran out of friends. And so then we had to just hire based on resumes and interviews and the standard stuff that we had no experience with. We were straight out of college. And we also didn't know any better to pay attention to company culture. And so not everyone we hired was good for our culture. And it wasn't any one single hire that killed it. It was just slowly like death by 1,000 or 100 paper cuts. And yeah, and then just wasn't a fun place to work at anymore. And so we got super lucky with the timing. This was during that first early dot-com boom. So we were able to sell the company to Microsoft for $265 million. And then after that, I actually left Microsoft right away and formed an investment fund with our head of finance at the time from Link Exchange, the prior startup. And we invested in about 20, I think it's 27 different companies, of which Zappos happened to be one of them. But then I realized that over the course of a year that for me, investing was kind of boring, and I really missed being part of building something. And so out of all the investments we had made, Zappos was both the most interesting and also had the best culture, really liked the people there. So what started out as being an advisor and investor, I just kind of slowly got sucked into spending more and more time with Zappos, and within a year was full time, but there wasn't like an official date. I just got slowly sucked in. And so from the beginning, wanting to make sure that with Zappos didn't make the same mistake again for a couple of reasons. One was from a business perspective, but the second was I had just sold to Microsoft, and so technically I didn't need to work anymore for the rest of my life. And so I was thinking, like, if I'm going to go into an office, I better enjoy these people I'm working with, because otherwise, what's the point of it? And so Fred, who he and I basically got involved with Zappos at the same time, he and I would kind of do the final interview anytime we hired someone. And so the hiring team, and they do all the standard interviews, like fit within the team and so on. And then when they basically wanted to give him an offer, Fred and I would take him to a bar and have drinks with them and ask ourselves at the end. It was actually super simple. Is this someone we would choose to have drinks with, even if we weren't forced to work together? And if the answer is no, then we just wouldn't hire them. And that worked pretty well till we got up to about 100 or so people. And then
it's a lot of bars.
Yeah. And so then we couldn't keep doing that. Otherwise we'd wind up in AA at some point. And so then we started telling all the managers, like, culture is really important, and which sounded like was a good idea. But what happened was some of those employees that were making those decisions, these managers, had only been with the company for 2 or 3 months. So they didn't know, they had in their own head what they thought was a good culture, but good culture fit, but it wasn't always in line with what Fred and I would have thought. So then our head of legal at the time was actually the one that suggested you should come out with you should define your culture, basically, instead of just saying it should be in line with our culture. So that was kind of the evolution of the Zappos core values. I just sent an email out to the entire company and asked everyone what should our core values be, and got back a bunch of responses. And then we kind of consolidated some of the ones that meant the same thing. Initially had a list of 37. We thought that's too many to remember. And so then eventually came up with our list of 10 core values. And that whole process took about a year. And then we rolled it out and integrated it into our hiring process. So when we hire people, our HR recruiting department does a separate set of interviews just for culture fit. So they were like the equivalent of me and Fred doing it. And then we also had performance reviews be 50% based on whether you're living in inspiring the culture in others. And then we also set up a process where even if you're doing your job function perfectly well, if you're doing something that's not in line with our core values, that violates our core values, then you can be fired for that reason alone. And so I think building that structure and those processes definitely made a big difference. And when we first rolled it out, I remember it was pretty frustrating for a lot of the managers that, just they need to hire someone as soon as possible. But like 50% of the people they want to hire are getting rejected from our HR department, and that's still, I think, probably a little bit of attention today, just because everyone wants to hire as quickly as possible if they come across what they think is the right candidate. But I think that's one of the things that has really protected our culture as we've continued to grow. And so, super long-winded way of saying that's the second side of the triangle of accountability.
But helpful, right? Helpful. I think a big topic for this conference was definitely the care that every organization should put into their employees. And if you don't have the right people on the bus, that's oftentimes what takes companies in the wrong direction, right? And your Microsoft example with Link Exchange was a perfect example of that.
Yeah, and so I mean, we kind of did have the attitude of, as long as it's for a while, pre-Holacracy, if it's in line, if you have an idea, if it's in line with our culture and it's about customer service or customer experience being a differentiator, like, go try that experiment. Where we started running into some issues, and this was right around the time we started adopting Holacracy, is, and I don't think this was because of, I'm almost going to sneeze, but now I'm not. No, but now it's not coming. So I don't know if
You're tearing up a little bit though. So
no, I know, but it's not because I'm
jumping jacks or something.
I just want you to know it's not because I'm emotional about the answer to this question.
He looks super emotional right now. I'm like, Tony's about to say something real
deep. Okay, I think it's passed. So, anyways, what was I talking about? Oh. Yeah, so this is right around 2012-13. We had this coach named Augusta, and she started out in our call center and then eventually became our life coach for all employees. And people loved her. A lot of employees would have regular meetings, and it was very in line with our culture, and it was great. She was part of the tours, and when she eventually left the company, there were people, there was a void to be filled. And what we found out was what ended up unintentionally happening, because we're sending this message of do whatever you want. And as long as it's in line with our culture and whatever, is we wound up with like 10 or 20 people that all wanted to be life coaches. Right. And so, that ratio doesn't make sense given our company's size, but we didn't really have a mechanism to restrict that. And so,
it wasn't just a matter of 20 people wanting to become life coaches. When you send that message, it's kind of similar to defining what your core values and your culture is. If you don't define what self-organization, self-management is, just go do whatever it is that you think brings value to the organization. We had some challenges with that.
Yeah, and even in our call center, similar thing. We're like, oh, we're self-organized and self-management. Go, just make sure you're answering phones 40 hours a week and work whenever you want. Well, it turns out everyone wants to work the same time, and so no one wants to work the other times. And so then that actually had bad ramifications on our actual customer experience, even though if you look at it from a single employee perspective, it was very reasonable for them to make that decision. It's just when everyone makes the same decision. And so so that's where we started experimenting with different ways of putting in constraints. We came up with a system called People Points, where it's kind of like it's analogous to top-down dollar budgeting, but it's top-down where you spend your time or how many full-time employee equivalents you have in terms of budget. And then now that's gone through a few iterations, and today we've put a cost to each People Point has a certain cost. And so if you have a circle, just going back to the life coach example, if you have a circle with 20 life coaches, that's going to cost you 20 times a lot of money, which will result in a big number. And so if you don't have the revenue to support that, then you're not satisfying this new constraint we added, which is make sure you don't run out of money. Because the constraints of headcount or budget used to basically be driven by our finance department. And the transition we're making is instead of this top-down 300 circles or teams, it's each team is kind of independently making their own decisions and trade-offs and going from a hierarchy to a networked org chart.
Really, and that's where the market-based dynamics program, the extension of Holacracy, comes in, right? So market-based dynamics, a simple definition, at least for me, is that every team or every circle, as we call it in Holacracy, not only thinks like a small business, but acts like one, right? And so with that, we've created this market internally, like the city analogy that you were using earlier. Why this system? I know you talked about the cities, but what does this system give us that, say, Holacracy didn't give us?
Well, I think Holacracy out of the box doesn't have anything aside from the typical, in terms of resource allocation, just top-down resource allocation. And so the resource allocation part is not that different from what happens just in a normal corporation with a normal hierarchy. And so one of the goals with, we call it customer-generated budgeting, is that that basically it allows for much more dynamic resource allocation. And you don't have to explain or justify to your equivalent of your boss or parent circle or to finance why you want or need more headcount. And I think in any large organization, budgeting is a weird process where as you get close to the end of the year and you have extra budget left, then there's this weird incentive to use it or lose it, because if you don't use it, then you're penalizing yourself for next year because you'll get lesser budget. And also every year there's this process where you try to get more headcount and bigger budget, which is not always necessarily the right thing. In this scenario, say if you were my manager or parent circle lead link, if traditionally you gave me a budget of $1 million a year, the change we made is, instead of you handing me $1 million a year, we're going to flip it. You're now my primary customer, and we sign a service agreement where I'm going to provide these services, basically whatever my accountabilities used to be, and we're going to sign it for $1 million a year. But what that does, and so that was kind of the step one of customer-generated budgeting. It's more just a slight mindset shift. You're my main customer instead of my boss. And then what that enables, though, is now I can go find other customers, internal or external, and fast forward 5 years, maybe I have 10 $1 million customers, and I essentially don't have a boss anymore. You were my old boss back in the day. And that just gives people a lot more freedom. And maybe I don't like working with you, in which case I could choose not to take on work for you. And so it gives us a lot more autonomy, but it also enables, in the old structure, I basically have to do whatever you tell me to do as my boss. But I could decide, you know what, I used to do this thing for you, but I'm really passionate about something else. It might be totally unrelated, so I'm going to try that out. And if that brings in revenue, then I get to hire more heads automatically because of the revenue that it's bringing. I don't have to go to you for permission to do that.
Right. One of the things that John Bunch mentioned yesterday in his presentation, one of my favorite aspects of market-based dynamics and this customer-generated budgeting, was that in the old system, all it took was one no to crush an idea. And in this new system, all it takes is one yes to have an idea get off the ground, right? And that happens through this, through a circle-to-circle transaction or negotiation or some kind of what we call it service agreements, which is a contract between two teams. And then ultimately, it's every circle provides a menu of services. These are all the services, the competencies that they have that they can sell other teams. But that also comes to ideas as well. I think one of the reasons that we even moved into Holacracy and ultimately into market-based dynamics is because we wanted to tap into the creative genius of the company, right? You have people with marketing degrees that are sitting on the phones taking phone calls. And ultimately, if they have a great idea about marketing and the marketing team doesn't take that idea in, they can still have a chance to actually get that idea up and running.
And one of my favorite stories is about Holly, who heads up our HR department. And so she has a team that is providing HR services for all our 1,500 employees, but turns out she's also passionate about running. And so she and a team started, it's called Love Hate Running, where they do these fun 5K races. They just had one in Temecula for and I think 500 people showed up, and there were sponsors and so on. And I forget the exact numbers, but I think they basically had that circle had revenue of, call it 100K, and then after expenses and all that, ended up making a 30K profit. So now she can just take that to either throw another 5K or grow the team, or maybe start some other things she's passionate about. And then she's also passionate about our local hockey team, the Vegas Golden Knights. That is their corporate, I think it's 100 or I don't know how many people, but they're not big enough yet to have an HR department. And so she signed a contract with them to provide HR as a service to them. And so she's actually now able to leverage her team to help other organizations as well. And I just have a hard time imagining how either of those things could have happened in a normal hierarchy. Right. But I think it's one of the cool things about MBD is she gets to do stuff that she's passionate about.
Right. And MBD is market-based dynamics. One of the advantages I think you just mentioned and when you talk about like a company that stands the test of time, right? And the goal is to be a company that's still around in 100 years. This system also enables teams to go externally. So if they're providing a great service internally, there's nothing stopping them from really delivering that experience to other companies. We do business with a lot of companies here in downtown Las Vegas, but we're starting to kind of expand on that. How do you see that changing self-organization and changing future work for Zappos?
You mean in terms of what our employees are actually doing?
Going externally with these
I think
businesses.
That's one of the exciting things about it. We have another. I don't know, is Shelby here? Probably not. So we have a software developer that was in charge of all the software that just sent emails to our customers. And under market-based dynamics, he's now opened up a real bar down the street on Fremont Street. Oh, I think you guys were there yesterday, right? Mm-hmm. And so he was able to do that, and then in order to do that, he had to tap into the menu of services of other circles. And
right.
And so I think being able to do stuff like that is pretty cool. And he's doing experiments. I don't know if he's done this one yet, where one of the ideas is if you buy a drink there for $10, then you also get a $10 coupon code for Zappos. So basically, it ends up being effectively a free drink. And then he's going to look at how does that affect what is the behavior of those customers in terms of basically what's the customer acquisition cost, and then how loyal are they, and so on. And so that might be some random thing that happens. The other thing I like is just use the bar as the example, or if someone wants to open up a Zappos bakery in our lobby. For most Silicon Valley type of tech companies, you have to figure out a business that scales, where you start out small and then there's this kind of this exponential growth path. Otherwise, it's not a business worth getting into. Whereas for market-based dynamics, if someone wants to open up a cupcake bakery and they can support themselves with just the steady volume of cupcake sales and cover their payroll costs and so on, then I'm fine if they do that for the next 10 years. They don't need revenue growth, because from Zappos' perspective, the way we grow is by pumping out more of these circles. But each circle itself, if you want to run a one-person, a cupcake bakery, as long as you can pay for it yourself, go for it.
Right. So we're working about 5 minutes here, and I probably have 2 more questions to ask you before you get out of here. But and we referenced Teal a little bit, John talked about it in his thing yesterday, but in the last chapter of Reinventing Organizations, it talks about oftentimes what gets in the way for companies becoming the best versions of themselves is often a company that owns them, right? So I think a big question probably everyone is thinking is like all this craziness, all this self-organization. We were bought by Amazon back in 2009, acquired by Amazon. And at that point, they had 5 tenants for us, and which allowed us to be a completely free company, operate as our own subsidiary, and then keeping our core values and our culture, and really with less interruption and less constraint from Amazon. How does Amazon feel about this? Because I think to a lot of people, a lot of businesses, this is a crazy idea, right? But how does Amazon feel about this stuff?
Yeah, well, Amazon's growing quickly too, and so I don't even know how many employees they have, like hundreds of thousands, probably approaching 1 million, I'm guessing, if they haven't already. And
It's 1 million this year.
and so as they grow, there's no choice in a hierarchy but to create more layers of management, and so that creates more bureaucracy and so on. And so, like, they are looking at us as basically a really worthwhile, interesting experiment from their perspective, because we're so much smaller than they are as a whole. And what I think they're particularly interested in is the dynamic resource allocation part of it, and then all the other stuff that you and I are excited about, like the innovation and new ideas and stuff. Like, they're thinking, oh, if that happens, that's just icing on the cake. But I think the idea is, the way they're thinking about it is have us figure it out, and then once we do, then they can have a tiny part of Amazon, maybe a couple thousand employees, also adopt the system, and then when that works, then kind of spread this throughout Amazon.
Okay, and a minute each for these questions. But what do you feel like has been the hardest part of this whole thing over the last 7 years that we've been kind of on this explicit route to self-organization? For you, what's been the hardest?
Probably the patience required. I know. I mean, I still miss the early days when we were like 10 people. You could have an idea, and then I'm also a software developer, so I was able to code that idea, and then it'd be live on the website, the next day. And so, So I think as an entrepreneur, I would guess that most entrepreneurs are always impatient and just want more stuff to happen faster. It's kind of like we're trying to, dismantle a cruise ship and build an airplane at the same time, and make sure that neither of them fall apart while we're crossing the ocean.
Right. So no doubt, I mean, there's a lot of hard things when you talk about organizational transformation, right? But what are kind of some of your key learnings, and maybe some advice that you would give our community here about organizational change? And I think Brian Robertson yesterday kind of mentioned like some of the success he's seen out there is from homegrown tools, right? And certainly market-based dynamics is one of those, and the way we're approaching budgeting. And even some, our systems that we use for people to manage their business is all homegrown. But what some advice that you would give anybody out here for moving forward?
I would say definitely, whatever your organizational culture is, try to socialize this, both the word and this idea of and practice of experimentation, because it's pretty hard. Like, if you can pitch whatever you want to do as an experiment and figure out what's the cheapest experiment you can do to not roll out everything, but just to get to the next step, and it's cheap and it's a reversible thing, then it's pretty hard for anyone that's remotely rational to argue against that. And then, I mean, even for us, I think that's one of the things we need to, for us, core values, like the literal words of our core values, are now just normally part of our everyday language, and we don't even realize, it's more when outsiders come and they say, oh, that's weird but cool that people just normally say our core values in our emails and everyday talk. And so I think we need, for us, we need to do the same thing for this experimental mindset and how to think of experiments and like versus arguing opinions or predicting things. If we can, and so I'd say same thing for any organization. If you can just, something you want to do, just frame it as an experiment that you can quantify in cost and that you can say, and you can reverse it, then it seems like no matter how hierarchical your organization is, it should be something that is probably easier to convince for helping take the next step towards organizational change.
Cool. So time flies when you're having fun. We could probably use 5 or 6 more hours with Tony, but he's got to get somewhere. If you guys are interested, we covered a lot of concepts here, a lot of ideas. We have out on the Evolve table in the lobby, we have some QR codes that you can scan, and if you're more interested in this stuff, we can reach out to you. Also on the table is very specific initiatives. If you scan those QR codes with your phones too, it'll teach you more about what we're doing in market-based dynamics and menu services and things like that. But everyone, thank you, Tony.
Thank you.